and thank you so much for joining us today. Super excited to kick off this session. I'm Mitali Gupta, an innovator and strategist based out of Berlin, and I'm so honored to partner with the Impact Hub Network to lead this session of Impact State of Mind on behalf of Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area. For a little bit of context for our new joiners, Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area is a nonprofit supporting entrepreneurs and change makers through programs designed to help impactful ideas succeed. We work across the New York Metro broadly and are part of a global association of entrepreneurial communities in more than 100 cities and across 50 countries. Impact State of Mind, particularly, is a virtual series created to support innovators and connect the impact community. These sessions are a way for entrepreneurs to connect digitally and internationally on topics that are at the forefront of social impact today. We are so excited and honored to have Andrea Reyes online with us today. Andrea is a fair trade advocate, educator, and sustainable fashion matchmaker. She is the chairman of the NYC Fair Trade Coalition, a network of small ethical business owners and advocates. She runs the Sustainable Fashion Community Center and is also the founder of Bernadette, a sustainable fashion mentorship firm, which aims to educate and incubate businesses to include more sustainable practices into their business activities. Lastly, she's an educator and published author through Bloomsbury Publishing. So we're super excited to have Andrea here over with us today. Let's dive right in. We would love to hear about your work dedicated to responsible consumption and climate change. So tell us a little bit about NYC Fair Trade Coalition, the vision, and the overall goals as it relates to the SDGs.
Sure. So the New York City Fair Trade Coalition, we really started first as a loosely affiliated networking group. And over the years, we've grown to provide more services to members who are often changing as they grow, right? We often think of ourselves less as a traditional nonprofit and more as a movement taking up space in the sustainable fashion world, and we say almost filling in the white spaces. So, you know, in the beginning, we had a lot of members who were just starting off, trying to figure out what sustainability meant to them, what ethical production, consumption meant to them. And we've kind of grown with them to help them improve their supply chains, whether it's finding more ethical resources to do production, but really to find a support system, to find a community of like-minded individuals. I first started working with artisans in East Africa and Uganda back when I was still in university. And I remember having a really hard time not making decisions necessarily, but feeling supported and feeling as those decisions were the best ones, because I was often having to go it alone. And, you know, whenever I reached out to friends or family saying, hey, you know, what do you think of this? They'd say, hey, I think you should get a full-time job, right? A 401k. They want that stability. And as an entrepreneur, I hate to say this, but I probably thrive in the unsustainable, right? Or not the unsustainable, I thrive in the unstable and wanting to problem solve and constantly wanting to do better. So, you know, we actually adopted the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2018. And if any of you guys know about fair trade, there are fair trade principles. There are actually 10 of them, and they look very similar to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we loved about the SDGs was that it wasn't just about highlighting issues in the countries we were producing in, but the SDGs really connects the Northern Hemisphere with the Southern Hemisphere. So we could highlight different businesses or different things we were working with and have it connect, like I said, not just to the artisans that we're working with, but also to our members and the people who are working stateside or who are working, you know, in the countries that, you know, quote unquote, we didn't need those tools to advocate for ourselves, because I think we can acknowledge all across the globe there are those who do very well, and there are those who are struggling, and inequality exists everywhere. So we needed some sort of tool to thread that story or connect those dots.
Thank you for sharing that. Maybe let's kind of go back to the fundamentals. Can you give us a little bit of understanding of what fair trade means to you? How do consumers in the landscape understand it today? And where are the largest gaps that would help the community learn more about exactly what fair trade is and these principles that you adopted? How can you help incorporate those better into society?
So fair trade, we can actually see its origins back in the 1950s, but even prior to that. And it's interesting looking at fair trade, how we perceive it in the United States versus how people perceive it in Europe. I would say Europe is way more ahead than we are. Fair trade labeling and certifications are much more common in supermarkets, and now more so in the fashion industry. But in the United States, we have a lot of work to do on educating people the importance of fair trade. And one of our taglines is the answer to inequality is fair trade. If we could be more connected with the products that we consume, knowing where they come from, knowing why they're either expensive or cheap, and connecting the power that we have to our purchases, a lot greater change could happen here. And to your question of, what can we do to foster that change, is really meeting people where they're at. Everybody consumes, everybody wants to, I would say, if you asked anyone, are you okay with this item exploiting someone? They would probably say no, but they're just unaware. We say consuming is our national pastime in the United States, and we do it quite mindlessly. So if we can meet them where they're at, whether it's with a clothing swap and putting them on their sustainable journey to learning more about where their products are coming from, then that's our task at hand. It's figuring out where they're at and how we can push them forward without using guilt or shame, because that's what happens a lot of times in marketing and branding, right? If you don't have this toothpaste, if you don't have this clothes, you're not desirable, you're not sexy, you're not loved. And we don't want to participate in that kind of negative exploitation of customers and consumers. So how can we connect the positive impacts that your purchases have, and not necessarily use, guilt marketing, or some, sustainable or fair trade brands use cause marketing, which can also be detrimental to the person that you're purchasing from, the artisan. So there's a lot of nuance there, and the hard part is how do you make it simple and clean and clear, while leaving room to have a deeper conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's interesting that you mentioned is how to educate these consumers without advertising or guilt marketing, etc. But it seems that in the world today, this is one of advertising, marketing, branding is one of the way that brands kind of get across their story and where they're coming from and the practices that they do in the sustainable space. So how do you think, in a world that is so digitally connected, which is also so international and remote, how can we get to these people and get this message across if we do not utilize these means or these avenues of communication?
Yeah, so traditionally, when we're talking about marketing, we often see price, quality, and newness, right? So we're going to advertise that it's 25% off, the quality, right? Luxury associated with the price, and then newness, this new trend. So I really encourage brands to highlight the good that they're doing, but then also where they could do better. And that's where real courage takes place, right? Because I can say all the wonderful initiatives that I'm doing, but nowadays I feel like it's also somehow related to this reality TV show, right? Like, we love reality TV, we love seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think it also resonates when we're selling products. So there's a tactful way for you to let the customer know your goals for the future, how you could do better, how with their support you can do better. And that really fosters loyalty and authenticity. So it's this kind of pairing between transparency, storytelling, but doing it in a way that is genuine and not too contrived or too placating to people's emotions.
Makes sense. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what led you to this work. So why are you passionate about pursuing this, and how did you end up where you are?
Yeah, so I feel as though I've been born into this. The story is not uncommon. A lot of our members have similar stories where their family were makers of some sort. My father actually made my mother's wedding dress. So I grew up just with a family full of sewers. Yes, definitely a DIY world. And we used to go to the thrift store, and this was back in the 90s when bell bottoms, in 2000 when bell bottom jeans came back into style. So we would go and tear up old man pants, put, inserts in them, and make our own bell bottom pants. And it was just fostered that you use what was available. And it wasn't necessarily because that was the ethical thing to do, but that was the more fun, creative, challenging, to just go and buy a pair of pants. There's no story, there's no emotion to it. And so often in our culture, we put things on our body or in our mouths to soothe ourselves or to make ourselves feel better. And I really grew up in a family where they encouraged not the act of consumption, but the act of experiences or doing something together as a group. So fast forward, a decade or two later, I found myself at the Fashion Institute of Technology, studying pattern making. Got a job pretty early on in the fashion industry and realized that there had to be more than just making money and not having time to spend it. So I quit my job and I went to East Africa. I spent 6 weeks in Uganda and saw all the secondhand clothing that ended up there. And I became obsessed with, how did this clothing get there? What is the end of its life? It's just going to end up in a landfill, possibly. So I came back and focused my next round of studies on international trade and marketing. How could I make things using recycled materials? And back then we would say, advertise them as going green, right? Going green, upcycled items. And I've really kind of dedicated myself and the work that I do to exploring sustainable fashion since then.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that journey. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that you kind of picked up along the way, especially when you were in Africa. You mentioned this whole movement around going green and using upcycled items, etc. How would you kind of see that this can also pose some unique challenges in this space? So for example, what is greenwashing versus authenticity? What is consumerism versus degrowth, or consumerism versus having experiences like you had mentioned? What about having transparency versus just storytelling for the sake of storytelling? So can you talk to us a little bit about these challenges and how might you see that we can overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so I think for a long time I was against sales, right? I was like, I don't want to play that game. It feels very manipulative. I don't want to do this kind of high-low strategy. So by design, most retailers, after 19 days of something being full price, they'll knock it down by 30%, and they'll knock it all the way down to 90%, and they'll still have built in profit margins at that 10%. So like I said, it feels scammy to do it, but then I realized that I had to play the game to a certain extent. So to your question, here at the Sustainable Fashion Community Center, we have a lot of events, and we have events that are, so today we're doing an eye pillow workshop where people can come and make a lavender scented eye pillow, and afterwards a sound bath. And you may purchase an item, a ticket for $25, and at the end you're going to have this item that you've made. Or you may realize that, wow, this was really hard to make this, right? We're going to do one coming up, a mask chain for your, a jewelry mask chain. And the maker who makes these things will be right there. So all of a sudden you'll start to see value in the thing that is made because you've actually tried to do it with your own hands. So that is a perfect example of this kind of experiential retailing or experiential marketing. Are you paying for the mask chain, or are you paying for the experience? You're kind of doing both here. And it's about being forthcoming with that strategy, right? You have the opportunity as you're making these things to have a conversation. So talking about where you've sourced your supplies from, really expanding that consuming experience. I think it is a mistake, or we've gone too far in convenience, right? I was thinking to myself back when we started to really see things being shipped in 24 hours, or frictionless shopping, right? Going into the store, grabbing things and leaving without having to interact with a human. And I said to myself, what are we going to do with all of our free time, with all of our downtime, if we're not, if we're always shopping, but we've broken it down to be as quick as possible. I hate to say we've switched over to now, endlessly scrolling on Instagram and things like that. We filled our time that way. But I think it's such a missed opportunity to use it as a point of education, a point of connection, a point of community building. So it's interesting, we kind of do the opposite of maybe what most other stores would do. We invite people to come in, we offer them coffee. We want you to stay as long as possible here, and we're not too concerned with how much money that you're spending, because statistics show the longer you spend in a store, the more money you will end up spending. So if we can reverse our behavior and not be so aggressive with, oh, let me tell you about salesy, right? And if we can take more of a community approach, it might be a long game to, have those dollars come back around to us. But our initial goals are being fulfilled, right? Community building, educating, helping people, like I said, along their sustainability journey.
And what is your view in terms of brands that are coming up, or even the ones that have been pretty established, or smaller boutiques, smaller artisans that are opening up their own practices? How sustainable friendly are they? Is that one of kind of like the first things or the top things that they consider as they build out their story and as they build out their production change? Or does this kind of come later on as more of a luxury segment once you've actually created some sort of revenue, some sort of kind of traction in your business or brand?
What an interesting question. So in 2020, we had a lot of businesses go out of business, right? And statistically speaking, 1/3 of businesses, fail anyway. So we kind of had this purge of what I hope unethical brands. And it's kind of yet to be seen how many new brands or new companies really started in 2020, just because a lot of like ideation phase, and then people may not be getting registered for a year or two, right? So we don't really know how big small businesses will explode over the next couple of years. But it is really heartening to see how many of them are putting their ethics first and foremost. And I can really point back to the pivotal and tragic passing of George Floyd, because before George Floyd, no one was willing to say Black Lives Matter. No one was willing to, these big brands, right? These big organizations. And overnight, I remember seeing on a New York City street kiosk, New York City saying Black Lives Matter. And all of a sudden, it just transformed where you needed to talk about your ethics. You needed to talk about your standing, because then if you weren't, you were part of the problem. You were complacent, you were an enabler. So things have really changed in the past year, where a lot of brands feel emboldened or even forced, right? Really pressure to share how they feel about certain issues. So with that kind of trend, or with that change, I think the smaller, newer brands who have always been more open to, these newer sustainable brands embedding ethics into the foundation of their business is only growing stronger. And I think the challenge for so many small brands, and myself included, when I first started, was having too much story, right? You only have your customer's attention for maybe 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute if you're lucky. And I remember pitching them, I'm working with artisans in Uganda. We're using great recycled materials. Each item highlights an environmental cost, right? Out of all that, how much are they really going to take with them? So I think, the challenge is, once again, keeping it simple, but having all of that additional information, research, science, conversation somewhere on your website, whether it's a blog, whether it's, your about page, digging in deeper. because I've definitely seen some brands that are putting out there, first and foremost, that they're ethical, that they're sustainable, but doing a little, digging on their website, don't really have the information to back it up, or it only goes so deep. And I will say the ethical consumer, the conscious consumer, is probably the most critical consumer. So it's important to have that information, because you don't want to lose them just, by not disclosing honestly your producer, right? They really want to know where they're located, their address, their name. They want to be able to really feel secure about the purchases that they're making, especially if it's a higher end product.
Super interesting. I think I agree with you in the sense that, there's this story around being sustainable, being ethical, where you produce from, etc., that now every brand is talking about. So at a point, it feels how much of it is really authentic versus not. However, it is nice to see that there's an overall positive trend towards people wanting to at least be more sustainable and wanting to find out that information. But on that note, would you say that there is a certain demographic or a certain age group that is more interested in these conversations versus others? Do you think that it's more the millennials, or do you think maybe even the older generations are actually coming to terms with this as well? What is your thought there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I teach at or maybe I didn't, I teach at a university. So they gave us a little preview into Generation Z, right? They had this professional come on and they were talking about how Generation Z is very conscious as far as caring about causes, but they're also very feel as though they can't do it all, right? So they may stop buying almond milk because almond trees take too much water, but they're going to go and shop fast fashion. So they're a little bit fickle in, or we think that they're so much more conscious than we are, but really they're kind of picking and choosing. And, of course they say, oh, they're spontaneous, they're this, they're that. And it had me thinking, they're not from a generation per se, they're just 20, right? Their brain hasn't fully formed till you're 25 years old. Impulse controls, they're just young. And we can kind of say the same things maybe about, millennials. Is it the fact that they're millennials, or is it the fact that they're between the ages of 30 and 45 and their consuming behaviors happen or have changed or influenced because of the life that they're leading during those years? And the same with the baby boomers. So I think there in every generation, there has always been those people, whether we call them hippies or conscious consumers or whatever it may be, that cared about the environment, that cared about where their products are coming from. I think now there's just more of them, or they're more vocal because of the tools that we have at hand, right? Whether it's social media or the fact that we can't turn a blind eye anymore. I love the fact that Netflix, for example, the fast food or fast fashion of media, movies, you can now go on and watch a documentary about the fashion industry, about the food industry, about how toxic the beauty industry is. So all this information is really at our fingertips, and it's interesting, well-produced, entertaining materials. So it really is, a great time to push consumerism in a different direction. But it's also a good time to highlight that like I said, you can't turn a blind eye anymore. We're all aware of these things to a certain extent.
For sure. Since we only have 6 minutes left, I'm going to quickly wrap up with my questions and then move on to questions from the participants. So a couple more things for you. What other projects in relation to responsible consumption or climate change or the other UN SDGs are you working on or excited to be working on outside of everything that you've already talked about?
Sure. So as I mentioned, this Sustainable Fashion Community Center here in East Harlem has really been interesting. Having a physical location where people are dropping in and learning about us, and having a place to point to and say, these are all the things that we can do. So recently, a property manager, realtors reached out to us about doing clothing swaps in their buildings. I think they're so many companies that are realizing that they can't manage their waste and that it's not really waste. So I'd love to say the reuse sector is popping, right? There's so much that we can reuse, and we can really get creative and innovative with it. It just needs to be accessible, and it needs to be something that people think of before just running to the stores. So I'm really excited to see how that unfolds over the next year as more people see how we've made recycling somehow sexy, right? Recycling, traditionally you think of the least sexy thing, but how we can do fabric swaps and clothing swaps and plant swaps and book swaps and do it in a way that is fun and engaging and community building. So I'm really, like I said, excited to see where these types of partnerships take us.
Super interesting. And how can people from the community support your work or get involved if they wanted to, whether it's with the reusing of the waste or whether it's with other sectors that you're working with? What do you need from the community that is missing today, and how can they potentially reach out to you?
Yeah, so we have a few different types of ways to get involved. Kind of the easiest one is to become an annual member. So we don't just take businesses, but we take individuals, those who want to support fair trade. But then if people want to get a little bit more involved, they can come volunteer at the community center. And in exchange for volunteering, giving your time, you can always swap things for free, which is really nice to, like I said, exchange your time instead of just money. But stopping by and taking a look at our members' gift shop is always a great way to support. And just following up with us, because we are often doing a lot of events, both in person and in virtual world.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. And before we open it up to questions, is there anything else you might like to highlight to the community that we haven't discussed?
Good question. Good
Mhm.
question. Yeah, this holiday season, I'm really just highlighting or bringing awareness to the impact that our online purchases have. It is staggering to think about how much fuel is consumed or used just delivering your packages. So I encourage people to get out of their house and go walk somewhere to buy something, take a train, take a bus, take your bike. Try to stop 24-hour shipping, 48-hour shipping. Even go to the mall, which is strange to say, but if you go to the mall and you pick up all 10 of your gifts there versus having a delivery truck deliver 10 items separately, that impact goes a long way. So I just beg people to be a little bit more conscious, not just what they're buying, but how they're getting it.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to move on to a couple questions we have here. So somebody first wants to, first of all, thank you for this amazing chat. They say that the global supply chain for them as a consumer is unfortunately anything but transparent. So in your opinion, are these fair trade marks or sustainable practices that companies are putting out, and we did allude to this a little bit, are they just doing good for the ecosystem, or is it a quick and easy way for the consumer to feel good? Or how genuine and authentic is this, and how can you validate it?
Yeah, it's really wonderful. So let me say, it's terrible what's happening to our supply chain right now, right? It's broken, but it's wonderful in a sense that so many people are getting education on supply chain, right? I've been studying supply chain for years, and every news program I turn on, they're like, look at all these container ships outside of the port. And I'm like, oh, this is great that they're learning how fragmented our how we make things really is. So I think that this is a systematic problem where brands are going to have to not necessarily do the best thing for the environment, but what they do may be the best thing for the environment. So with coffee and chocolate and wine, we advertise single origin coffee, single origin chocolate, meaning that all the processes are happening in one place. I think it'd be so interesting, single origin fashion. So we have a wonderful member in Burkina Faso where they're growing the cotton, where they're dyeing it, they're knitting it, they're making garments, and everything is done there. So I think, a lot of brands said transparency is the key, but there's something known as data bombing, right? There's an organization right now that has come out with a lot of information about your products, about its impact on climate change, on the fuel, and it's almost too much information. And the metrics that are there really deceive or cloud the consumer's judgment, right? Is more information always better, or are they just making the story almost incomprehensible? So I hope that we can move towards a path where brands are wanting to shorten their supply chain and are wanting to look at available resources that are closer by, even if it's not the perfect zipper or the perfect thread, or dare I say, you even have to pay more for it.
Thank you for sharing that. I will take one more quick question. I know we're at time, but really quickly, somebody wanted to ask that they're actually currently searching for talent. And as a member of the community at NYC Fair Trade, how likely is it to connect with students interested in internships and jobs with startups? And just as reference, they're an NYC founded fashion house, but based in Italy.
Got it. Yeah, so we actually have an apprenticeship. So what we do is people become monthly members of the Fair Trade Coalition, and seeing I'm a teacher, I get a lot of interns our way, and I really groom them to what we say manage up. They become kind of project managers, learning about video editing, social media, graphic design, a whole host of things. And once they've kind of been groomed, I offer them up to our members to work with them, and they get paid minimum wage. And really trying, to work on a project basis. And the hope is that we'll be the middleman for maybe a month or two, and then that relationship will continue. Because what we've just seen is that so many small businesses, they're a one-man show or one-woman show, and aren't really used to delegating, or aren't really used to working with someone. So like I said, we almost are mentoring both business and student to make this relationship something that is a bit more long lasting.
Great, thank you for that insight. So we're right on time. So just wanted to take this opportunity again to thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us today and for sharing all this great knowledge around sustainability and fair consumption. Super insightful to have you with us today. To the audience, thank you again for your time. If you have any more questions, please feel free to write to us at newyork@impacthub.net as always. And we very much hope to see you at the next session.